Hello again, gamers and GameX, and welcome to yet another episode of Not So Hardcore Gaming. I'm your host, Jeremy, and today I'm pretty happy because I'm going to be talking about one of the first games I've played. And looking back, I can remember some of the very first games I played, at least for my own console, were when I got my Xbox 360, and the games that I remember playing very early on were Halo 4, Far Cry 3, and then today's game, which is Assassin's Creed 2. One of the earliest games I had that I personally had, and the very first Assassin's Creed game I ever played. And it's well known as a lot of people's favorites because it has Ezio in it. So he is my favorite assassin straight away, and this was the start of his journey. You know, this was where everything began. So let's get into it, as we always do. First off, before we go into anything else, I want to point something out that I noticed. There are so many sexual innuendos in this. So many. It's probably slightly juvenile humor, but sometimes that's the best kind of humor. I love that type of humor, truly. So it's definitely not a bad thing. It's just one thing I've noticed playing through. There is a lot of that. Now, going into what we usually do, visuals and audio, before I talk about it too much, I'm playing it from the Ezio collection, which is remastered. Starting off though, personally I haven't noticed a major difference as much as I would, and I can't compare it exactly because it has been a year or two since I played the original on the Xbox 360, so it's not the best comparison I can give because it's not as fresh, but I kind of expected more from it going into it. You know, it didn't change enough that I would call it flat out a remaster. You know, it is better. Like it is definitely at least better to a certain extent, but there's sort of a certain threshold that you expect when it says remaster. You expect there to be a lot more to it, but this one just it wasn't quite the same. You know, it wasn't quite what I expected from it. But going into it, I do still like the visuals. So don't get me wrong on that. I like the visuals. I just didn't notice as much of a difference as others probably would have. The lighting was all that really changed. I don't believe I've reviewed Assassin's Creed 2 on the podcast yet. So, you know, there's more to talk about for the story, that sort of thing. But I wanted to start it by saying that it could have been better when it comes to visual improvements. Although, in saying that, I think when they focused somewhat on lighting, I feel like that is one of the most important things when you remaster. You know, you want to get that lighting right because it really makes things more vibrant. But I would have loved to see them focus on a few extra things as well. But the character models, I want to start by that. Ezio, straight away. And it's interesting because I know what he looks like in later games, and this is Ezio when he's really young. So it's kind of weird, like for me, like looking at him when he is so young, because I'm also used to him having more facial hair, that sort of thing. And I do like the way the character, like his face and the rest of his body, really is modelled. Due to the remaster, and especially because it's a much older game, the way they talk a lot of the time, it just seems odd. You know, it's like uncanny valley, as they would say. So it sometimes like that would take me out of it, because when you look at it and you think, okay, this looks at least somewhat better than the original, so you see that comparison where you've got the visuals look the same, but the way they move, sometimes it looks old gen, and so it just seems off. I know that probably sounds weird, but that's the best way I can really explain it for that. But in terms of just the look of things, I do like the character model for at least Ezio, especially like the scar. That is one thing I always liked. So I love the way that Ezio was modelled. There I had no complaints. One I did have, though, that it just didn't really look right. Character model that just didn't quite seem right was Lucy. And the weirdest thing about it is sometimes it wasn't as bad, but especially when I was first going into the game, and this is right at the start when you're first going into the Animus. When I looked at her model, and I just thought to myself, it doesn't look right. And the reason was, it looked like looked like someone wearing a heap of makeup, you know, where it's just smooth, too much white. You know, there was nothing in terms of characteristics when I was first looking at it, and that was just so off-putting. It really was. It was really off-putting for me that it looked just not right. As I said, it's one of those things that you look at it and it just makes you feel weird, because you can't quite say exactly how it makes you feel, but you just know it rubs you the wrong way. And in other areas of the game, it wasn't quite as bad. But this was right at the start of the game, it looked horrible, and other times it looked pretty good. So there was a bit of an inconsistency for her especially, but there have been inconsistencies really for a lot of areas from the game, but that's the most noticeable one for me. So yeah, it definitely could have been done better, I think, especially for some of the character models, but it's not much that I can say takes away from the game itself. The game itself, I love. I just feel like some of the potential for the remaster was squandered, which is a shame. Apart from visuals, we have audio. Now, going into it, we'll talk about a lot of the voice acting, and I actually like the voice acting for this game. To this day, I like it. Desmond, for example, I love the way he was voiced, and especially when you see shades of his character, and you can only get so much character in one game, if that makes sense. And I liked what I saw of him. You know, one of the first things I noticed was sarcasm. Now, having a sarcastic character can be annoying at certain times, but for him, I didn't mind it. I liked his sarcasm because it wasn't too in your face, you know? And the voice that was chosen for him worked as well. The voice for Ezio, very well done as well. You know, he has that charismatic voice. And that's really the best way to describe Ezio, is very charismatic. He has a lot more to him, but that's like the first thing you notice about him. And not just that, but as well as having that side to his voice, he also changes quite a bit throughout the game. During the very first stages of it, because a couple years pass throughout the game, the way he talks changes quite a lot, and that was a detail I quite liked, because he's really young when it starts. It's really early on in his life, and I think this time I'm going to break a rule that I will often do, and I'll talk about more about the story. So, if you don't know the story yet, I recommend seeing it before you continue. So, spoiler warning, but moving into it now, very start of the game, his family is executed. His father and two of his brothers were executed. And that's what really drives him to go after the Templars, because it was a family friend who led to their death, basically. And this game really was mostly motivated by avenging his family. And I would probably do the same if I were in his shoes, especially during that day. But I do prefer in future ones, where he doesn't have just vengeance in his heart and he does it for other reasons. And for this, it didn't take away from the game, but it's one thing I noticed I slightly preferred when that changed in future games, if that makes sense. And to the topic that I was saying before, his voice changes throughout it, and just by the way he talks, he gets a lot calmer after a couple of years when he started to learn the assassin's ways. And, when he starts using the Requiesca in Pace, and I probably screwed that up completely, but we all know the line. And that's actually my favourite line from any series, really. Any area from the series. And then when he starts using that, I think it shows how he grew. And I quite like that, because at first he was really angry. And after he killed someone, he's screaming at them still. Then, just from pure anger. And seeing him change from that, I quite liked. And yeah, the voice was very telling for that and very fitting. Apart from that, the other characters, of course, Desmond and Ezio are the two most prevalent characters. You also have Sean Hastings. I have a love-hate relationship with Sean Hastings. Sometimes he seems a bit too much of an asshole, but it's also sometimes funny. So, yeah, it's I'm a bit ticky on him. And I think, again, that was a voice that was perfect for his character. Especially being British, he's eloquent, and then when he wants to roast you, he'll do it. So I loved that. The voice acting for this, I wouldn't want to change at all. I loved that part of the game, for sure. I'll go on to sound effects shortly, but another thing I wanted to point out, which is, it's actually one of my favourite finer details throughout these games. I love that it has a mix of, translated, so that it's speaking in English, as well as parts of it that aren't translated, so it's in Italian. I love that detail, because it adds that bit of character to it, and I think it has a lore perspective in it. Once they upgrade the technology, it's not as prevalent, so it doesn't happen quite as much. And that, I like that they incorporated it into the story to it as well. But it adds so much flavour to me to have some lines that aren't translated. It's just such a nice little detail that I think adds so much to it. So that is something I really have to put out there, because it's one of my favourite things about the game. Absolutely love that. Moving into sound effects, for example, the weapons, because there aren't many weapons, you can't expect to have many different weapon sound effects. But at the same time, even when you go from one sword to another, there is no difference. I would have liked even just that little change, even if it's just a pitch change or whatever. It's a case that not having that doesn't take away from the game, but it would have been such a good detail if they did put it in the game, if that makes sense. So I was a little bit disappointed, because there's not a lot. There's not a lot of sound effects for the weapons that you have. I would have liked to have seen more. it can't take much away. It takes a little bit away from it, but I can't let it go too far, if that makes sense. Because, I don't know, like, even though I don't really say scales of 1 to 10 or whatever else, in my mind, I like to think what I'm doing there. You know, I like to think, what would I rate it? And when I look at details like this, it would probably take like half a point away, whatever else. So, again, it doesn't take much away, but it would have been better if they did have it. So that's just a lot to talk about on the visuals and audio. Overall, there is definitely room for improvement, and also quite a few of these I think it did well. And I would love to see in the next couple of years them remaster this. Like, I would love to see one day basically built from the ground up, use the same audio, that sort of thing, because the audio for it was quite good. You know, the voice acting, that should never be changed, but I would love to see it at today's standards. Like, imagine that, like 60 frames per second, 4K of the earliest games in the series. That to me would be the coolest thing ever, because I love these games so much. So hopefully one day we'll see it, but unfortunately, I can't comment on it because it hasn't happened yet. So I've spoken a little bit about the characters themselves, when I'm talking, like while I was explaining some of the voice acting for them. But before we continue too much more, I want to point something that I think it was a really good way for me to start the game. Now, as I said, I played this game 2, maybe 3 years ago for the first time, and last played it about 2 years ago. Which would have been around when my Xbox 360 started to decline in health, so to speak. And yet, it still got me nostalgia. And the most interesting thing about nostalgia, especially for me, is even if it's been 1 year, I still get that sense of nostalgia. It may not be as strong as someone who, for example, played a certain game 10 years ago and then they're playing it again. They get that really big hit of nostalgia. I get it from something just 2-3 years ago, because this was before I was as into gaming as I am now. This was when I was just getting into it, and it was one that I loved so much, and just booting up the game was awesome. You know, when you're first getting into the Animus, especially, like starting up, when you're just before you get into the Animus, I didn't get much, but as soon as you start seeing the simulation booting up ancient Rome, that was awesome. I don't know how I managed to screw that up. I don't know why I said ancient Rome. That's just not quite right. But Italy, you know, when you see it first, building the cities around you, when that first came up, I suddenly got hit with so many memories, and my excitement to play the game again skyrocketed. I was already excited because I knew how much I loved playing the games originally, and I was quite happy to see it again. But as soon as it started building the settings for you inside the Animus, the feeling was just amazing. I could remember so much of the game, and it felt right. You know, it felt like I was going back to when I was first playing it, and that alone is an incredible thing. And I was so happy that I got that feeling. So I just had to quickly mention that, because it's only specific games that can get you to do that. You know, it's games that you have when you were really young. They have to be good games for them to give you that much, which is just awesome, just plain awesome. Moving on to some of the characters, because this is an earlier game, there isn't a lot in terms of characters. You know, there are only a few certain characters, and being such a short game, you only get to see so much of them. And by a short game, it's not short, but not nearly as long as it is nowadays. And as it being there, you can only expect so much, because when you remaster a game, you can't change the story. You can't extend the story. It's only visuals that you can really change. So when you look at the story based, it's not quite as elaborate as it would be nowadays. In saying that, I still like the characters and how they're written. As I mentioned earlier, Desmond, he seems to have pretty good morals about him. That's always a good thing to have in any main character. They have to have good morals, unless they are specifically designed to be a villain, if that makes sense. So I've always liked the way he was written, and as I said, little hints of sarcasm and jokey humor. Humor, as I've said a million times, and I'll say a million more times, humor is such a good thing to have in any game and for any character, and he has just enough humor that it's sort of, you get a few giggles out of it, and it's just quite charming for him. Then Ezio, as I said, is one of my favourite game characters overall, and especially one of my favourite assassins. I have always loved Ezio, and the way he's written, as I said, in the earlier games, he's not quite the same, and I prefer Ezio later in his life, but for the earlier games, he, as I said, he still has that charisma about him, and even through the game, showing him calming down a lot more, learning to control his anger, learning to respect the dead, that sort of thing. I loved seeing the growth for him. So even if I didn't like his character as much at the start, watching the growth was really good, and I loved seeing that change. Obviously, those are your main characters. As I said, you've also got Sean Hastings. As I said, a little bit iffy on him, but in the end, I'm more likely to like him than not like him. So, yeah, it's iffy, but I hope that makes sense. Next up you have Rebecca Crane. Now, I like Rebecca. I liked her character. She's your classic nerd, basically. She loves the technology. She's very inventive, very creative for it. And that's a good thing to have for any character. It's always just, the nerdiness, the love of what you do for that is great to me. So I've liked the character, and that's really what you get to know about her. And especially, she's got a good heart, so she's a really good character for me as well. I do enjoy having her there. And, it's just worth mentioning. She's, as I said, she's not as prevalent there, and you only really speak to her a couple of times throughout it, but it's still just enough to know, I like her. So I won't talk about every character. If I talk about every character, it would take a very, very long time. And really the only other character I want to mention a little bit is Leonardo. Now, having him in this was quite good for me. Especially the way his character is written, and obviously he's based on Leonardo da Vinci, right? It's definitely based there, but they have to have certain creative liberties, because it's not like they could talk to the man and find out what his personality was really like. But the way they wrote his character, and especially mixing some real inventions he made, that sort of thing, was impressive to me. And then, as I said, the creative liberties where his character is just, again, he's a real inventive type. He's a thinker, and I very much enjoyed watching that the whole way through. And he's another one who seemed really caring as well. So I loved how he was written, that they could add enough personality in without, because if they overdid it, it just wouldn't be right, that sort of thing. So I liked the way that he was written and the way most of the characters were written. I don't really have any complaints for any of the characters I've come across. You know, some of them get annoying after a bit, but it's not that it's a badly written character. Now, and this is one of the last things, the gameplay itself. There are a few things to say on it. First of all, the control scheme, it's more complicated than I remember. So getting used to it all over again, it was so weird because it's sort of... You know when you're trying to think of a name and it's in the back of your mind, but you just can't quite get there. It was quite like that for getting used to the gameplay controls. I knew what to do, and I knew I was familiar with it, but it had been so long, I had to retrain myself all over again. So it was a really interesting experience, you know, saying, oh, this is weird, and then very quickly being like, oh no, I remember this. And I love looking at that, because as I said, it's such a change. It's especially since I recently played Valhalla, which is the newest, as well as I've been playing Odyssey quite a bit, and they're a lot later in the series, so the controls have changed drastically, and looking at the difference there was just so strange, like seeing it so recently, so close to each other, just how much the gameplay has evolved, and playing it in the order I have, it's devolving, if that makes sense. So, again, it's a bit of a rant, but as I said, it was really interesting. But in terms of the gameplay, it's not bad at all. I actually like having a bit more to it. The only thing about it that I didn't quite like as much is, especially when you're going to do parries, counterattacks, that, to me, the way it was designed didn't quite work, because you can either go on the attack or be in a defensive mode. You can't very quickly switch from attacking to getting ready to counterattack. So a lot of the times I'd be there waiting for them to attack for a minute to counterattack, because it's satisfying doing it, but the disconnect between the two, to me, was a bit rough, but not game breaking. So that's just, let's get that out there. The control scheme, as I said, there's a lot more to do, but the combat system worked 90% of the time. There were still some things that didn't quite work, and especially I've had a couple times that characters will get in a loop of some kind, you know, falling off a bench, then jumping back up to fall off, jump back, fall off, again and again and again. That's happened a couple of times. So they're minor things that just grate on you when you discover them, but when they're not prevalent, you don't mind as much. So that's, yeah. As well as at the climbing. The climbing for the game has two sides to it. Some of the time the climbing is so smooth and beautiful, it feels good. Other times it is utter crap. There have been a few times that I'll get stuck on something, or he just won't jump up and instead he jumps away from the wall. And you go to drop down one ledge a little bit and he ends up falling the whole way down into the pile of hay, and you didn't want him to do that, and he does it 4 goddamn times because he keeps doing it. That has happened too many times. So it's sort of, as I said, it's not bad when it works, but when it doesn't work, it is beyond frustrating. I've even had times when he's jumped the complete wrong direction. I've told him jump to one side and he jumps to the opposite side to perform the leap of faith when you didn't want that at all. So that is a problem I've been running into quite a bit, which, again, it's an older game, but it's just so frustrating that you can't look past it as just, oh, it's an older game and they couldn't change much. It just gets to you. It grates on your nerves for a bit because it happens so much. But, again, I'm getting a bit ranty. So as I said, like when it works, the gameplay is beautiful. As well as that, I kind of don't like unlocking all the new, especially the climbing techniques, jumping up and grabbing onto a ledge. I kind of like, as from a lore perspective, how he learnt that. I like that it was related to the lore. That's when he learnt it. But I'm kind of upset I couldn't go to earlier stages and then use it. You know, it can be frustrating because you can do that from memory, but you forget you have to wait until halfway through the game. So it was a bit disappointing, but once you had it, it added so much to the gameplay. And as I said, lore perspective, good, kind of irritating though. That's most of what I can say about the gameplay. It is definitely flawed. And in some ways, having something that has flaws isn't a bad thing. Because nothing is ever going to be perfect, and sometimes flaws are what makes us human. And this game was developed by humans, so you can't expect them to get it perfect. And I would never expect that, and sometimes minor flaws can add character to a game. Some minor things don't, but it can, so I don't mind that. I really don't mind it too much. And it's just there, you know? A few more notes that I had which I wanted to talk about, and one of these will come back to visuals earlier. Every now and then, as for the remaster, which was never the case in the older game, you'll have a certain character that they have this colour sheen over them. And it's like it reminds me of Aurora Borealis, right? You know, the wavy colours that you see in the green, the mix of those colours. Imagine that, but on a character model. And that's moving, and it's not part of the character. It's just there. It's a visual glitch. I've noticed that quite a bit. Don't know why it's there at all, but it's there. It's sort of, I look at it and I think, why the hell is that happening? But it also looks cool because it reminds me of the Aurora Borealis, and that is a beautiful thing. So it's this double-edged sword, you know. I kind of like it, but I don't understand why it's there, so it's just strange. You know? It's strange. Moving on from that as well, one of the worst things I think really is the most annoying part of the game is when you're exploring certain crypts, and to experience everything for the game, you have to explore crypts to unlock the best armor in the game, for example. But the camera is not built very well for it. So I've had multiple times where you'll go to jump one way and the camera doesn't move with him properly, so you can't see him properly and you can't move the camera while you're in there. And it's only here or there, but sometimes it's the difficult jumps that you have to attain, and that's when the camera decides, nope, I'm not going to move with you. That happens quite a bit. And that is probably the biggest pain in the neck from this game at all, is sometimes the camera doesn't move with you. Those are the only other notes I really had to talk about. And that's pretty much everything. Overall, I do love this game. I really do. As I said, it definitely has its flaws. It definitely has things which can really annoy me. But even just because of nostalgia, it just reminds me when I was first playing it, when I was new to games, and it was a whole new experience for me, and it was wonderful. So it reminds me of back then, and even despite its flaws now, I still can't dislike it. I really, really do enjoy this game, and I greatly recommend playing it. Whether you haven't played it before, or you have played it before, maybe play it again, or experience it for the first time. As I said, it's not going to be a perfect experience, but it's going to be a pretty damn good experience. Thank you for joining me today, and I will be seeing you next week. And quick update for you, in probably about 2 weeks, so not next episode, but the week after, will be 1 year since I started this podcast. And I've got a plan for that. I've got a plan for what the episode will be. Please do stick around and keep an eye out for that one. But in the meantime, I will see you next episode. Bye-bye.